Thank you very much, Karen. And as you said, I've worked on populism and Euroscepticism in my career. They were, when I started, two rather minor phenomena. They've become somewhat more central. And I'm very grateful to Karen to invite me here. I'd be very honoured to kick us off with what looks like a very interesting programme. And what I want to do, just in the time that I've got here, is to abuse my position a little bit, which is I've seen the papers, I've seen titles of the papers, and I've seen what's going to be presented, and I'm going to talk in very general terms and not be very empirical. I want to give you something of a think piece, an overview about populism and about how we should understand it and some of its key features. So if you think there's not much evidence to what I'm saying, you may well be right. And I'm happy to be disproved or for you to provide evidence either way. I think that's what we should be doing. I just marked 90 essays of my students. And I said to them all in the introduction, you must tell me what the argument is and what the structure is going to be. So let me follow my own advice. I'm going to simply argue that we have neglected one key aspect of populism, which is its relationship to politics. And I'm going to argue that there's something called unpolitics, which is central to understanding populism. And I'm going to do that by talking about the definitions of populism, what we see as core to populism in general, and to look at some of the things that we share in common in terms of our definitions, and then to address the notion of politics, and then to look at the notion of unpolitics, and why I think that's important. I'll then try and illustrate that by arguing that there are what I would call three tropes, or secondary features of populism that occur in the different instances of which we can look at. And I will illustrate those three cases. And I'll finish by talking about why why populism challenges the nature of representative politics and how we should respond to that. So that's kind of my agenda. I'm going to talk in very broad terms, and I'm going to, although this is about Western Europe and the US, I'm also thinking much more broadly than that. I think that one of the key things we should be doing as scholars is to think about populism as an international historical phenomenon. And I'd like to just warn you that I'm thinking not just about the contemporary phenomenon, I'm thinking more broadly, which is probably an excuse for getting things wrong if it's about Europe. But anyway, we can come back to that. It's a truism to say that there's a lot of populism about. I don't have to evidence that for you. But it's not a truism to say that there are many different definitions of populism and there's lots of competition. Actually, that used to be true. I think now there's quite a degree of convergence. And I think, let me just suggest to you, it's partly as Karen kindly said, we just published this Oxford Handbook of Populism. And this is not a sales pitch because it's too expensive to buy, but it's a pitch for the argument that we made in that volume was to suggest there are three different approaches to populism. The first being the ideational approach, to see populism as having ideas, containing certain ideas that we all need to understand and that we can recognise in order to understand populism. The second is to see populism as merely a strategy. And that means that it has no core ideas, but it's a way of getting into power and holding on to power. And the third are the more sort of socio-cultural approaches that emphasise discourse or cultural languages and the style of politics, if you like. So I think I'm not saying that any one of those three is better. Actually, I am. I'm going to say I think the ideational approach is kind of winning out at the moment, but this is not a democratic decision. Scholars can have different approaches to it, but what I'm saying to you is that there's quite a lot of convergence around what we know as the core ideas of populism for those of us that see it as an ideology. For those that see it as a strategy and the socio-cultural approach is somewhat different, but there's actually quite a degree of convergence. So every time I saw a student saying we don't know what populism is and there's many different definitions of it and we have no consensus, I'd think, well, I'm not sure that's so true. It used to be true, but I think it's now true. And I think the work of someone like Kaz Muller obviously is very, very central to that, and I give him credit for clarifying a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. the elements, therefore, that come about and are, I don't think we'll be surprised to any of you that work on populism. I'm going to pick 3, and you can pick 4 or 5 and pick your favourite 3, as it were, but these will be something that will be very familiar to you. So I would suggest to you that 3 core notions that populism has to have, there's some agreement about. Of course, bear in mind that, along with Ben Stanley, who talked about the empty heart, the thin-centred ideology of populism, we've got to recognise populism is never a whole ideology, always attaches to something else, and that's a problem. But that's not a problem I'm going to deal with today. I'm going to put that to one side for the moment and say that when we look at the thin-centred ideology of populism, these are the 3 core ideas that seem to come up. The first is an attack on elites, or an attack on the establishment. And this is relatively straightforward. We know that all populism attacks either identifiable groups or coalesces them into what it calls an establishment. We know that it varies as to what that establishment is or who those elites are that it opposes. We know that right populism will have different enemies than left populism. For some it's corporate elites, for others it's liberal elites. But whatever direction they come from, they frame their opposition to elites and their opposition to an establishment. That's pretty straightforward, I think, in some respects. But on the other hand, I was going to say in a moment, that's not enough. I mean, that's true of many political ideologies attack either elites or an establishment. The second core feature is what people tend to refer to as the people. They argue that populists celebrate the people. I'd say more broadly that we could say that populism is people-centred in some senses. I actually don't really like that notion, though. I've suggested a slightly different version of that, and I'll explain why. I think all populists celebrate a heartland. The people are the occupants of a heartland. The reason I don't like this is because I don't know a politician that says I'm against the people. So in democratic politics, that's not, the opposite is almost impossible to get. So I think we need to be a little bit more concrete about this. And I think that for me, populists construct an idea of a heartland. All populism has a heartland, and a heartland is different from a utopia. A utopia is something I construct by saying these are my values, and if I put all these things together and I change the world, this is where we're going to end up. So it's a future orientation. A heartland is a return to the past. And it's key for populists that they are saying, we want to get back somewhere. We want to get back what we have lost. We used to have something and we've lost it. Now, it may not be true that we used to have something, but that claim is very, very powerful and very important. When Donald Trump says he wants to make America great, he says he wants to make it great again. He wants to go back to something. And it's very important that the heartland is slightly fuzzy, slightly vague, felt rather than reasoned, and imagined rather than real. But of course we know that all nationalisms to some extent are imagined communities, but it's an imagined version of the past. I'm not a media studies person, but if I was, I'd work on Tolkien and the films of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. He had this idea of the Shires and the Hobbits. The Hobbits lived in the Shires. And if you've seen the films, the Shires where the Hobbits got on with everything, it was green, it was lovely. There was a bit of argument, a bit of fraction, but they just got on with stuff. And what characterised the Shires, that's the version of the heartland, is that it was essentially people being dutiful, getting on with things, being ordinary, but not really engaging in politics. It's actually a world free of politics, because actually really the other aspect of the heartland is that it's quite unified. It's quite monolithic. The people were not divided. We're just all hobbits together. And I think that's true of the way the populist version of the heartland is. It thinks of a unified conception of the heartland, where it knows who the other is. It's not immigrants, or it's not professors. It's not elites. It knows the enemy, but it doesn't necessarily have a clear definition of who its people are. But it knows that they're unified. So the heartland is very specific in the sense that it's a monolithic conception of a world almost without politics, because it hasn't got divisions within it. Because politics comes about from division. This matters for me very much. So for me, I think that when people talk about, when scholars and journalists write about the people as a core aspect of populism, what they're really saying is that they identify a population of a particular heartland, and it's often implicit. Sometimes it's explicit, Middle America or something. I'm sorry, a lot of my examples are going to be American. I'm just obsessed with Trump at the moment. I apologise, but I can't get him out of my head, and it's very worrying. But it's just going to forewarning you. So that those two aspects. If you want to say it's about the people, that's fine. And people do. Yanis Stavrakis talks about the people-centeredness of populism. That's fine too. I'm happy with that. They can recognise those two things, but they're not very. In a way, they're not that exciting to me or important about populism, because, as I say, anyone that's political is defining themselves in opposition to something, whether it's an elite, an establishment, or a group. So being against the elites is something, but it's not enough. Being for the people is rather banal, I think. And as I said earlier, most politicians wouldn't say that they're against the people. There's something more important about populism, and, because revolutionaries all times have been against the elites and for the people, whether you're communists or even fascists to some extent. There has to be something else. And the third aspect that I think is very important and is really underplayed is the aspect of the populist conception of politics. And if we take Kaz Mudda's definition, he talks about the people, the populist conception of politics is about the general will, the volonté générale. Now, if you want to pick a concept from political theory that's complex and ambiguous, that's one of them. All right? I think that it's not just about popular sovereignty, it's about the idea that politics is about us as a mass getting what we should be wanting, even though we couldn't get it by adding up what we all individually would like, or even by voting. I think there's something more fundamental. I think really fundamentally that the populist appeal is based on a dislike of politics, a rejection of politics. Now, in a sense, I'm sure you're thinking that's not really that surprising, because that's obvious. And in many of the language and the terms that populists will use in terms of who they're attacking, whether it be political parties, whether it would be elites or parliaments, you can see they don't like politics. They're often eschewing that the nature that politics has been done before. I don't want to operate in the same way. We should need to do politics differently is one of the key claims. But I think there's something more fundamental in this. In other words, and I think this is the core of the populist appeal is really appealing to a sense of what I'm going to call unpolitics. But before I come to the definition of that, one more thing about politics. For me, the way that populists see politics means that it is an activity that is not a good thing. If you're in this room, you probably are interested in politics. In fact, I know you are. You must be to some extent. So we all think it's interesting, important and useful in some sense. You may not like the way it goes, but as an activity we know it's important. But for a populist, the core of the appeal is not really to like that. And that's one of the reasons why elites are, in Kaz Mudda's definition, corrupt. It's because politics corrupts elites. In the true sense of the word, of making something virtuous into something impure. So politics is actually itself a corrupting activity, which is why populist leaders will often be people from outside of politics who get into it. I need to clean things up. If I'm a Berlusconi or a Babis or a Trump, I was trying not to say his name, but I failed. I'm coming from outside, and I need to get into politics. And the implication is I need to get out of politics as well afterwards. It's often I'll step in, sort out politics, get us back going where we should be going, and then I'll stand back again. So I think that indicates that actually politics is not a good activity for populism. It inherently doesn't like that. So what I want to suggest to you in the rest of my time here is that this, what I'm going to call a core notion of unpolitics, underlies the populist appeal. By this, what am I saying? I'm saying that by unpolitics, I'm talking about the rejection, the repudiation of politics as a means for solving conflict. It doesn't believe it's even a legitimate activity or a valid activity. It has a distaste for it, it's uncomfortable with it, and doesn't really want to be involved with it. Of course, populist politicians are not unpolitical, be it here at Wilders or Marine Le Pen, they're political to their core, but the basis of their appeal is to those people that don't really like politics in a fundamental sense, and that's the unpolitics that I'm talking about. This is not anti-politics. It's not simply wanting to be revolutionary, wanting to overturn things, because the key aspect of populists is they are not revolutionary. They are fundamentally reformists. Populists do not want to overturn democracy and set up a new system in its way. They're not trying to reject all politics in that sense and overturn it and invert it. So it's not anti-politics. It's also not apolitical. They're not without politics by definition. We're talking about them because they're being political and because they see a sense of crisis, something that other people think is very important to populism. That's what mobilises them into activity. So it's different from anti-politics. It's not a world without politics. It's unpolitics. And let me try and give you, it sounds a bit vague in your mind, it's fair enough, it's a bit vague in mine. Let me try and give you a metaphor. There's some football tournament going on at the moment, isn't there? Is that right? Is that right? I'm not very sporting, right? And this is quite a nice sort of metaphor. I don't really do football. Not just because I'm English. I don't really kind of get it. I never have got it. I'm never very good at it, and so on. But I live in a world where people talk about football all the time. I don't dislike it. I'm not anti it. I don't reject it. I think people get a lot of pleasure from it, and it seems to me, on the whole, a beneficial thing for society. So I'm not against it. I'm not opposed to it. I'm not without it, and I cannot be without it. I'm surrounded by people who talk about politics. In fact, one of the great delights of today was to not be there on the first day. My colleagues would be talking about it non-stop. But, no, I shouldn't say that, because actually I don't mind. I'm happy to be. I'm unsporting around in a sporting world, basically, if you take that metaphor. And I think that's the way that I think that populism is in terms of its politics. It's unpolitics in a politics world. I've got to tell you one thing. I taught students a course on populism, teaching for years. The most shocking thing I ever said to them was that I was not sporting. At the end, they said, "Why don't you like football?" That was just a metaphor. Anyway, so that's beside the point. But it gives you some idea of you cannot get away from it. You have to be engaged with it, but you're not. It's not part of your DNA, and it's something you find quite difficult. But you learn to live with it. You learn to engage with it, and that's, I think, how populists are with politics. Again, that's about the appeal that they have. I'm not saying that Nigel Farage and these individuals are unpolitical themselves, but the core of their appeal is to this unpolitics constituency or this unpolitics sentiment. So what, I hear you say. Very quietly, but I heard you say it. Okay. You told me this. What does that matter? How can you back that up? Well, this is the abstract stuff. Let me back it up by three things that I think you see in what I would call tropes of populism. In other words, they are not necessarily parts of populism. They are features that often occur with populists, but not always. Okay. So if you look at the secondary features, they're, again, to use the language of Ben Stanley, he always used to talk to me about the playbook of politics. These are the playbook of populism. These are the things that populists can draw upon and do often, but not always. The first thing you often hear in populist discourse, through time and in very different contexts, is an element of conspiracy theory. And that can be very different in the sense that it can be very clear and evolved and very explicit, or it can be implied. Now, conspiracy theory is the assumption that the world, well, not the assumption, that's the conclusion, that the world is being run by a group of people secretly who have agency, that are colluding to run things in their interests, okay, without doing it secretly. They're doing it secretly and effectively. Now, I'm going to put my cards on the table here and tell you, I don't think that happens, right? And I don't think the social scientists can think that happens, because essentially, of course, there are conspiracies in the world, but the world is not a conspiracy theory. And if anyone studies politics long enough, you know it's pretty much impossible to sustain that level of secrecy, that level of coordination, that level of agency to pursue a particular group of interests over time. You may disagree, you may want to disagree on this, but my assumption here is that a core notion of conspiracy theory is at odds with what we know about the world politically in reality, because it's essentially an attempt to simplify complex reality. It's a very convenient way of doing things. 9/11 occurred because there was a conspiracy by, we fill in the blanks, whatever it is. It makes a complex phenomenon more simple. And therefore, in a way, it's quite trying to squeeze the politics out of the world. You can only identify those people. The other problem with the conspiracy theories, again, and this is not my idea, it's very common ideas, it can't be conspiracy theory because if we can know about it, then it's not successful. And if it's successful, we wouldn't know about it. Right? So there's a social scientist, we might as well pack up and go home if the world is conspiracy theory. So I'm pretty down on conspiracy theories, you can tell. But I think that populists like this idea that things are connected, that actually there are networks that are doing this, that metropolitan elites, particularly liberal elites, and actually there might be active engagement. You see this in a case would be something like Law and Justice in Poland, who very much argue that the Polish society is still suffused with these post-communist networks that really are behind the scenes and running things. Now, unless you know Polish society, which I don't in great detail, that's why I'm here, their position sounds strange, but it's clearly got an element of conspiracism about it. The idea that there's something unified there driving things. And that's what they're attacking. When they're attacking European elites, when they're attacking ex-communists, they're doing the same thing. They think there's some connection there. So that's an example of conspiracism. It doesn't happen with all cases. I'm interested to hear some of the cases you're going to talk about, whether you think that's true. But it's quite a common tendency. Now, again, this is not a revelation that I'm making. Edward Shills made this in 1956 when he wrote 5 pages on populism in a book on American security that was just amazing, 5 pages on populism, and said it has tendencies to conspiracy theories. It's not saying anything new. Crucial, though, that the tendency to do that is because it's trying to simplify complexity and it's trying to lose the conflict that's in the world. And you see that rhetoric come very often in the way that populists present themselves. The second trope that I'm going to identify for you is religion. I'm not arguing that populism has a religious quality. I'm going to argue that it has a quasi-religious quality to it. In other words, the populism in certain features tends to look a bit like a religion, or tends to think of the world in terms that look like a religion. What do I mean by that? Well, the first instance of this is perhaps the most obvious one, is that people often say that populism relies on charismatic leaders. Now, and I think the term charismatic is used far too loosely. It means something very specific, doesn't it? It means, if you go back to Weber, it means about being blessed by God. It's individuals blessed by God, and you follow them, not the office that they hold. It's not just their personality, it's something about being a particular form of leadership. Now, so I think that the tendency to move towards what are potentially charismatic leaders, or to favour charismatic leaders, therefore fits in with that notion. That gives it a quasi-religious quality. That the key leaders become central to their movements. Whether it's Chavez or obviously close to home, you might want to dispute that in terms of Jean-Marie Le Pen and his daughter. But there's something about the idea of charisma that's very important. Another aspect of religion is the idea of the virtue of the people, that the people are blessed, and somehow that they're really the good ones. And that idea, again, not my idea. The idea of the virtuousness of the people is common to populism. And I think it's sort of quasi-religious, that without knowing it, that the people being dutiful, just getting on with things, not being involved in politics, they're the right people, they're the blessed ones. Another aspect you don't see so much now, but you did see in the earlier incarnations of populism, was the emphasis on an evangelical teaching aspect, which is that the American Populist Party, the People's Party, and the Russian Narodniki were very much about going to the people and teaching them, and about spreading the word about what they should be doing to some extent and mobilising them. Especially the American populists in their early incarnations were very much a movement, a cooperative movement, trying to teach farmers about how to work cooperatively to try and prevent the hold that was being held over them by the banks and the railroads and so on. But it was a sort of teaching quality. There were teachers that went out. And that's a sort of quasi-religious, evangelistic quality to it. And the last and the most important part of the quasi-religious aspect is what Kirk Hawkins, the excellent scholar who works on Chavez and now working on populism more generally, talks about as the Manichaean conception of the world, i.e. the division between good and evil. And again, from my point of view, anything that polarises the world or that divides it into two is saying it is trying to break down complexity. But you can see why it works from a religious point of view. You're either saved or you're not. You're either of my people or you're not. So I think there's overtones of religion there, or quasi-religion, moving towards religion as a way of doing things, a way of thinking about the world. And the fact that populists think about things in black and white, therefore, indicates this kind of proposition, this tendency to move towards religion. Sorry, move towards quasi-religious aspects. Be very clear there. The last trope that I would identify is one that's much more implicit. I think conspiracies and quasi-religious qualities have been sort of noted before. But this one I want to talk about. I think that populism has a conception of the world that's often based around war. The politics is war. It inverts the Clausewitz thing that politics is a continuation of war by the means, and it's the other way around for populists, right? But actually they see populism as a type of warfare. Meaning, well, it overlaps a little bit. Obviously it means the world's probably quite divided between us and them. There's the enemy, there's us. That's very important, so it feeds into that Manichaeanism, that polarisation of politics. But it also explains why, for example, populists never talk about rights. They never assert rights. They'll say that the people are being unrepresented or not being dealt a good card or whatever. They don't talk about rights. There's probably something that they do, but just go with me for a minute. It's not a language they use. Why? Because in war, what do? You suspend rights. Right? The rights of minorities are not the key concerns in war. And war gives you the excuse to suspend rights. The sorts of conflict that populism engaged in is good versus evil. It's about it's a war of good versus evil, and therefore we need to suspend rights. It also, the war metaphor also is important in one other aspect, which is that populists tend to portray defeat as victory. It's easy for populists to say, well, why weren't you successful? Well, because the institutions were against me. I faced such an uphill battle. And you saw this with Steve Bannon, Trump's erstwhile lieutenant, if you want to put it in those terms. His language was, we were an insurgent force going into the White House. And even when we were in office, we were facing the deep state. The enemy, it's still there. That idea of conflict is essential. And therefore, sometimes you have to make tactical retreats, sometimes in war. And Chavez was very explicit about this. Kirk Hawkins was saying it the other day, he came and visited, and he was saying, Chavez used to often say, look, we've got to retreat on this one. I know you think I'm rejecting this, or I've lost this battle. I may lose this battle, but that's because I need to regroup and we need to have a bigger attack. And populists, one scenario for Trump, and just let me fantasize just for a minute, it's just very indulgent. Right, so let's say Trump does, continues on this current vein and doesn't get anything achieved, doesn't build a wall, doesn't stop Muslim immigration, and gets kicked out in 2020. So I just want to think about that for a second. And if that happens, what will he say? Will he say that is the ultimate defeat? No, he'll say, look, those elites, they beat me. They didn't beat me, but I decided not to continue. They're so deeply embedded. He'll have an excuse for not winning. And populists always have that. Defeat can be success, and that's part of a kind of war metaphor. How they think about politics is war. So those three things, war, quasi-religion, and conspiracism, are alternative forms of organisation, of thinking about the world, that in a way are ways of not doing politics. That's what I'm trying to suggest to you. Why does that matter? What does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the way that populism is at the moment, in terms of it's a very widespread force. We see it across the world. We see it in different forms, taking on different incarnations. And I'm very keen to say that as a scholar of populism, populism is not necessarily a bad thing from my point of view. It depends what it attaches to. It depends upon its thin-centeredness means it'll attach to our values, and whether I like it or not probably depends whether there's other values or what I like or not. Populism can also be a fantastic canary in the coal mine. It can tell you when there's a problem with gas in the air, something's going wrong with democracy, and if there's a lot of support for populism, we can recognise that maybe there is a problem, maybe there's some sort of problem, and I think that's something we're often quite afraid to say. But this is the final point I'll make to you then is this. For me, politics is about settlements and about conflict. Politics is not about everybody getting what they want. Politics is about deciding who wins and who loses, who gets what, when, how, when, the Laswell phrases. But it's actually about a series of settlements. Politics, all political systems have settlements, have constitutional settlements as to how the systems run. Whether your system has a codified constitution, or like my country, we don't have a codified constitution, there are very strong norms. There's a settlement about that. That sets the agreed norms of behaviour within that political system. The last few days in the Houses of Westminster, there's been real challenges to that norm about the role of Scotland and its ability to... the Scottish National MPs walked out of Westminster protesting the fact that Brexit was changing the constitutional settlement for them, not allowing Scotland to express its position on Brexit. But we also had a series of settlements on issues, on welfare states. We know the norms broadly within which we fight, which we conflict, in which we debate about what should we have in the welfare state, about Europe, about what European integration means. Now, that clearly in my country that settlement has just been shattered, and we're seeing the fallout of that. But because settlements are very dynamic, they will change, and they sometimes will shatter. But I'm just trying to get the point that all policy areas and all constitutional settlements and or even party relationships are based upon settlements, and these are dynamic, flowing sets of implicit agreements about who the winners and the losers are, and that if you're a loser now, that you may be a winner in another settlement, or that in the future you have another election and you can become a winner. Populism really likes to unsettle politics, and that's what is difficult for those of us who like politics. That populism comes into the system and it breaks down settlements. And Trump is the classic case of that. I can't not talk about Trump. He's disrupting the way that American politics functions, and as well as just the very norms of policy process and norms of policy. How do we deal with foreign and totalitarian, authoritarian dictators? That's rewriting the rule book on that. He's writing foreign policy, but also how he does that disruption. That might be a good thing. Maybe the settlements need to be broken. But that's why populism has the effect of unsettling the settlements, of breaking them down in extreme examples. And probably why, for us, as scholars of politics, why populism is so unsettling, in the other sense of the word. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's good to challenge us in that respect. But there's something fundamental about the failure of politics as an activity to be celebrated. If populism relies upon the appeal of unpolitics, and if that becomes embedded, then that's trying to normalise the breaking down of settlements, and that's a very difficult sort of politics to contain. One or two settlements breaking at any one time is okay, but to unsettle politics continually would be almost impossible for us to cope with. Thank you.
Thank you very much 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you all. Really insightful and really liked it. Very interesting idea that you are providing today. I just have a few remarks and one main question. First remark is, it seems to me that populist voters, they are interested in politics. So I wonder how that relates with your notion of populism appealing to unpolitical or people who are unpolitical or who are not really interested in politics. The second remark is about religion, and I wonder why you're taking your notion of this second populist trope towards religion, whereas it seems to me that some authors like Margaret Camden, for instance, they speak about a secular redemption in populism. So why do you think we need to take it more on the religious side of things? And then my question is about, when I listen to you, and I very much agree with everything you said, but it seems to me that you got your own tropism here, which is right-wing populism. And I wonder whether, for instance, the notion of the heartland and this imaginary path that populist leaders refer to would apply to left-wing populist movements, which are more progressive and seems to be looking towards the future rather than the past. So I wonder whether, and that's why maybe you were sort of saying that you are leaving this notion that populism has to attach itself to different ideologies. You said you would leave that to the side, and clearly it makes sense. But can we come back to that? And do you think there is a left-wing version of populism? And in that case, do you think all the features and tropes that you define here today, which again are extremely insightful and very interesting, do you think they apply equally to any left-wing version of populism, like Podemos or maybe Mélenchon?
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, phew. The same way. I'm going to give a really bad answer to the first question. I'll try and be better on the second two. Your first question was, how can populist voters are political? Yeah. And so how can they be, what's unpolitics got to do with them? This is my really bad answer to this, which is I'm trying to talk at a kind of deeper level than that. I think that in the sense that I'm saying that of course populist voters and populist leaders are politicized by actually probably concerns about the heartland, but I'll come back for a minute. But then whatever's motivating them, they are getting engaged in politics. And I'm sort of thinking forward, and I'm hypothetically saying, but they don't want to politicise themselves as an institutional force. They will, even populist voters wouldn't say. I mean, I suppose what I'm really saying is, I would imagine someone who's voting for the first time on populist grounds would often like to think that in the future they wouldn't have to get out and vote. It will get solved. That's why. So it's a bad answer because I'm giving you a hypothesis I cannot test and I can't give you evidence for. The only evidence I would give you is that populists very, very rarely institutionalise themselves as a party family, as an international force. And I think there is this kind of this image of being reluctantly political. The circumstance forces them to be political in the short term. So yeah, a bad answer because I can't tell you what will happen in the future, and I'm assuming that they will, in a sense, become disengaged from politics or change their politics. Your second question was about religion. That's a really interesting one. And you're asking, do those religious tropes attach to left-wing, be important to me, it's quasi-religious. It's not something that's actually been religious. They're having the features that look like religion. Do they also attach to the left? Well, does the left have any charismatic leaders? Yeah, sometimes. And does it attach to that? Is there kind of a zealotry about the left sometimes? Does it sometimes have the aspect of kind of going out to the masses and educating them? Hell yeah. So I think, although I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn is a populist particularly, but people portray in that sense. That idea of someone leading and mobilising the young left of Britain has those qualities. So yes, I think it does. Although I think your question's a really interesting one, because I suspect, I hadn't thought about it, there's probably much more quantitatively loaded on the right. It's much more natural to go with a charismatic leader for the right. But I don't know that, so let me reflect on that. My instinctive response is it does apply to the left. And your last question about a similar sort of question about the heartland. Is it true? Does the left have a heartland? It's a bit like the answer to the previous one. Yes, I can see left-wing versions of it, of getting back to, and there's a lot of things about to the old days when we used to have a unified working class and so on, but actually your question is much more subtle than that. Your question is not just about the revival of social democracy, it's about, as you say, forces like Podemos, and are they not constructing a utopia? Podemos don't count because they use populist scholarship, don't they? They've read Leclau, but I'm joking here. But they've actually explicitly used the scholarship to construct a future. But no, the serious point is perhaps they will end up to be, in my terms, I suppose what I'd say is if they end up being utopian, and then perhaps they're not going back to a heartland, and they may be moving away from populism, by my definition. But again, I think it's interesting. I think you're probably right in what you're saying, you're implying, certainly, that the heartland loads more easily for the right than it does for the left. But let me think more about that. Nobody's asked that before. It's an interesting one. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation and for really getting us started on thinking about populism, giving us the broad strokes. I have two questions. One is very simple. I would like you to give us the reference of Edward Schill. You mentioned his work, and I would just like the reference so I could look it up and learn more about it. And the second one is a question about if Donald Trump is the populist right, then could we consider Bernie Sanders his exact opposite, the populist left, perhaps?
Okay. The first one I can't remember offhand. It's the book in '56. I wrote a book on populism in 2000. The reference is in there, but I'll give it to you afterwards when my brain re-engages. I've never been asked to cite in a lecture. That's great. Bless you. Trump and Sanders, right? Okay. Let me. Trump's actually. You're feeding into my Trump obsession now, I'm afraid. Trump is interesting because if you take those three core aspects of populism, the ones I said at the beginning, all populists have. A celebration of the people, let's go with the general opposition to elites and a hostility towards politics, basically. How does he load on those? Well, is he hostile to politics? Yeah, right, absolutely, and for all the reasons that I don't have to go into. He doesn't like the way politics is done, he wants to bypass courts, all that sort of stuff, so he fits that one. Does he hate the establishment, and does he hate elites? Yeah. No question of that. He wants to drain the swamp. That's very much his appeal. What's interesting, though, is he doesn't really have a populist conception of the people. Trump doesn't talk about the people very much, as in the sense that he embodies them. He says, well, there's constituencies out there that have been left behind, or I don't use that language, but middle classes that have not been represented. But he doesn't do what populists normally do, which is to identify themselves with those people. Chavez would say, I am the people. I am you. You are me. That's a common populist way of talking. Trump never said this. Trump did. If you listen to his inauguration speech, he did. But that's because it was written by Bannon, right? And if you look at the language, and this is not my insights, these are from other people, from I think it's Kurt Hawkins and Cristobal Rivera Calvas who've done some work on this. If you look at the language that he uses, it's really interesting. When he's speaking freely, his appeal is not to the people, in the sense that he's saying, don't elect me because I'm one of you, I know you. He says, elect me because of me. I'm the Trump, I'm the fixer, I have instinct, I'm the stable genius. Right? It's actually his qualities that he celebrates. Populists don't normally do that. Populists normally say, I'm of the people, that's why I should represent you. So now it's in the the journal Nature, Human Behaviour, there's these short papers that looks at Trump's discourse in those terms by, I think it's Wilkins and Rivera Calves. Now I'm citing for you. You can see that. So interestingly, Trump doesn't actually load up in an orthodox way on all those three aspects of populism. But in terms of the tropes, I would say he loads pretty heavily. So 5 out of 6 in terms of he definitely is a populist, and I'm not going to quibble about it. But it's interesting how he doesn't load in a normal sense. Then take Sanders. Why do we need populism to define Sanders? I mean, Sanders is just a social democrat. There's nothing particularly... I don't understand why we need to say he's a populist. It's only because in the American context, you know, that America has this predisposition to thinking about populism. I think Sanders in any other context would just be a social democrat or even a socialist. I mean, yes, he talks about the people, but just in the way that most other socialists would talk about the people. So I actually don't think he's particularly populist because and for me, because my rule of thumb about populist is not the people or the elite. It's how do they feel about politics. I think Bernie Sanders is his appeal is about being political. He's been in politics for years and years as an independent, fair enough, and so on. But he's part of the political system. I don't think he embodies an unpolitics in my terms. So interesting. So I would say that Trump is unorthodoxly populist, although interestingly so. I don't think Sanders necessarily is, but a lot of people would disagree and think it's very important to see Sanders as populist. So I'm just trying to be a bit provocative.
Yeah, thank you very much, especially for explaining the hardware concept once again, because I read about it before and I didn't understand it, but now I understood it.
I'm still grappling.
Related to that, one question. I have a feeling that we define the hardware as being something negative. Right? But going back to the past is something that is inherently negative. I'm not sure whether this is really the case. I mean, isn't that a sort of theological approach towards having forward to the future? So that we learn from the past as well. I think we have to see what there was in the past. It might be better in the past than it is in the present. And related to that, if you want to contextualize all these populisms, if you want to call them that, are they not also a reaction? Are they not in themselves not just simplification, but also reactions to other simplification, like, for example, the need of a creator that there is an alternative.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to try and unpack that. The first point, I don't necessarily view the heartland as negative. My language may have given that impression, and I in practice, probably, yeah, most times I do think it's negative, but there's nothing inherently negative about wanting to go back to something that might have been very good. If there was a sense of community and there was harmony, and that so no, I don't, and that's very important for me, you know, with populism, as an analyst of it, I don't necessarily look down on it. I just think, okay, that's what I may not like the values it attaches to, but it may be telling me something about values. So no, I don't think necessarily there's anything particularly bad about the higher, but the point I'm trying to stress it's just the contrast to a utopian conception, a forward-thinking, and you might, you know, in the negative terms of the word utopia, you might say utopianism is bad because it's unrealistic. Okay, so it's not a value judgment to say, but it is to say that the kind of direction of travel of how you construct the sense of the world is very different. So for a populist draws its problem of what's wrong rather than what we've lost, whereas a utopian draws the problem of what's wrong for what we haven't yet achieved. And it's just a direction of travel. So I don't think that's opposition. That's negative, necessarily a judgment about it. I'm sorry. Remind me the other question you said afterwards.
Populism as a reaction to previous simplifications.
I think that's a simplification. No, I'm not dismissive. I don't know. I think about whether populism is always a reaction. First of all, I don't think populism is about simplification. The American populists were very complex, highly technocratic in their conception of politics. They wanted to create forms of politics that were highly complex. So it's I think it's one of the great misnomers to say that populists simplify things. I suspect, rather than saying that populism is a reaction to simplification, it may be a reaction to unification, to, in your terms, of elites not offering them enough choice, or the no alternative. So yes, that's certainly a possibility. So I take populism at its word. If it says this is what annoys me, I recorded there, I thought I don't swear. If something annoys me, then I say, okay, that really does annoy you. I accept that. And one of the problems we have with populism is that we very rarely take a populist at their word. They want to talk about immigration, but we don't talk about that. They don't want to talk about Europe, we don't want to talk about that. The problem is that we haven't talked about those things, and they're opening up those things. So I think I wouldn't say it's a reaction to simplification. It may be a reaction to the nature of the debate has become too unified. But yeah, that's a possibility.
One more question about the heartland, I know, I'm afraid.
That's all right.
I was wondering whether or how this notion could be distant from a conservative conception of the heartland, and in that respect. First of all, it makes me think of Alfred Mackinder's heartland, which is a conservative conception of geopolitics, early 20th century. Very conservative in its outlook. And at the same time, it also makes me think of people like Roger Scruton, in, for instance, News from Somewhere. So, where is the separation between a conservative approach as far as the heartland is concerned? Is it a conservative concept, or in what ways is it, or could it be different from a conservative conception of this ideal community and reactionary views in general?
It's not an ideal community, it's just the past where we were.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's the key difference. I mean, it might be the same. It might be I have no problem with the populist, with the conservatives being populist, but I would assume, I thought you were going to ask something different, which is, I have a real difficulty with what's the difference between nationalism and a heartland, because nationalism is an imagined community. God has given you the hard question I can't answer. But I think that there are values within that are explicit within conservatism. So conservatism would say it's about ethnicity, it's about a particular form of identity, it's about order, it's about tradition. That it has values within the heartland. Now, within it, what you're calling its heartland, I think those are actually core values, and they are establishing a utopian conception of what things should be. A populist doesn't say, what I really liked about the heartland was A, B, and C. And the reason I call it a heartland is because it's felt, I'm sorry to tap my microphone, felt rather than reasoned, right? And so there's a bit of blurring. Of course, some conservatives might be slightly vague about what it is that they're trying to build, but I think there are values within that it builds on. Whereas the heartland is a conception. It's like those old films where it's all slightly fuzzy around the edge. You're not quite, it's all green and nice inside. Not quite sure what it is. Not quite sure who those people are. But I know them when I see them. I know when you're one of us and when you're not. That form of politics. So I think that's different from a conservative conception. So there may be an overlap. Thinking about my maths at school, I was never very good at the Venn diagrams. Maybe an overlap, but it's quite different. I think if the conservative version is based upon key values, and populism has no key values. Populism has to take its key values from the things that it attaches to. There's no such thing as a populist policy, because what a populist advocates in one context will be very different in another context.
I have two questions. The first one is the relationship between the populism and the strategic adaptation. You spoke of that a bit, but with the decline of other cleavages. So the question would be, to what extent populism would be a type of strategic adaptation to the decline of other cleavages? Because on one way, if we look at it, for instance, in the 1960s or 1970s in France or Italy, for example, if you look at communist parties, they had more or less all what you say. They were anti-elite, they were celebrating the people, a strong identity, etc., etc. But we did not say at this time they were populists. We were saying, well, they are communist party. But now, because of lots of different changes, left-wing cleavages, etc., etc. So the reflection on this strategic adaptation to cleavage change. And the second question is also a bit more tricky. Is
that was hard enough.
What is the criteria to distinguish really what is populism and what is not? Because if we look, for instance, at how media consider what is populism, in general, we can see that media tend to consider, maybe Trump is an exception, but in general, media tend to consider that populism is an extreme phenomenon from right-wing or left-wing extremist parties. So there is a type of association between these anti-system party and the populist phenomenon. But us, as scholars, we know that it's not always the case. Trump, for example, is an example. He's in power, he's now in the institution. Peronism in Argentina also was a type of populism, but in power. So maybe I would like to hear you on this question. What is the criteria in the end? Because, for instance, Trump, of course, he has a populist strategy, maybe, but now he's in power, and he's still considered as a populist. So, what is your position on that?
Okay. Well, I can easily answer the last question. What the criteria? The three things. Sorry, the last question. The criteria for me do you have an implicit and explicit heartland, or are you people-centred in other terms? Are you anti-elite and anti-establishment, and do you have a real ambivalence about politics as a process? So I'm trying to put forward the idea that do you have an unpolitics underlying your politics? So those are the criteria. I think that people use the word populism far too widely, which is why I answered that earlier question. I think I want to draw it back from those cases that it's used. In fact, I wrote a paper with a colleague called Stijn van Kessel, who's an excellent scholar, and he's gone through great stuff. And we wrote this paper about just what you talked about, which is how is populism used in what we call the vernacular sense by the media, as well as by the academic terms. And he's such a great thinker, Stijn. I think he said, I think we should forbid the media from using the term populism. So I'm not sure we really can do that, Stijn, but I know where you're coming from. So I think the media use of it is very often just wrong, and I think a lot of the academic use is far too wide and far too narrow. And I'm trying to say, it really we should only use it when we really, really need it. Okay, when it adds something to it. So those are my three criteria. I then would perhaps think about the other ones as well, additional. But those are the core things. You have to have all those things. But my rule of thumb is really the politics one. It's really, are you based on an appeal that people that don't really like politics? The other question you asked about. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to be pathetic here and say it's so different in so many different contexts that 19th century America, 19th century Russia, Huey Long, Marine Le Pen. I mean, they're all such different contexts of cleavages. I don't think there's a single bullet answer to that. And very often, it is what populism attaches to, as much as the populism that is significant in terms of reaction to those cleavages. In European, let me ground it more. So in Europe, we'll take the focus of Western Europe. Is there something about the changing cleavage structures of politics and society that has given rise to the appeal of populism? Well, yeah. I think that's a bit of a no-brainer. But it takes some very different forms. And it's interesting, isn't it, that actually what we treat as monolithic force is so very, very different. And we're seeing that even within populists in Italy, when the populists come up with different versions of what they're attached to, how they feel about Europe. And populism has these versions of Euroscepticism, of regionalism, of anti-immigrant and anti-welfare state, very, very different forms. So I'm just reluctant to kind of say, to try and put them all into one thing, that that's the answer. I think as a comparative scholar, we need to know what populism is, but we also need to know about the context in which it arises to understand the form that it takes in that environment. That's a bit of a cop-out, I'll admit.
Thank you very much for very much stuff here.
Thank you very much.